Okay, so first some updates. First, by now you should have completed the Finch lab as well as Unit 3 Homework 2. Should have completed that last night. If not, then get that in as soon as possible so that I can post the answers. And additionally, if you haven't yet, please download the Respondus software. So you'll need this to take the Unit 3 quiz. There's a link to that on Moodle. So you'll need to download that before Thursday or at least before you take the quiz. Some upcoming assignments. So homework 3 is going to be just to fill out the key terms list and then upload that to Moodle. So that'll be due Wednesday at 11 p.m. So just the night before the quiz. So you can use that as a study guide. So filling it out will benefit you not only for the homework points, but of course to study from. And then today we're going to be doing the human evolution lab. This should be pretty straightforward. So just finish that up and get it posted by the end of the day today. Then we'll have Thursday, we'll have the Unit 3 quiz. And so again, you need to download that Respondus software. And all of the key terms have been updated. So there's an updated list posted to Moodle, which includes this lecture. Okay, so for today, we're going to be covering human evolution and the fossil record, and then we'll be doing the human evolution lab. So both of these things basically deal with the timeline and kind of the split between modern humans and the last common ancestor between us and the great apes, basically. So some initial questions regarding human evolution. So we know that humans and apes are obviously closely related. So the question before we start talking about human evolution is, what are some of the major distinguishing features between humans and apes? So probably the first thing that comes to mind is our large brain and also our skull shape and size. So of course our faces look different than apes, and we have much more complex thought and complex brains. Next, there's the fact that humans walk on two legs. So this is called bipedal locomotion or bipedalism. So we'll cover this a lot today. Then, of course, there's the upright posture. So humans always walk and kind of stand upright, whereas apes have a more curved spine. In terms of teeth, we have much smaller canines, whether that be for eating purposes or, kind of like defense purposes. That's another feature that we've evolved over time. Humans also, of course, use specialized tools and, today very specialized tools. And then we also communicate through complex language. So these are some of the features that distinguish humans from the great apes, from which we share a common ancestor. So when we think about these traits, one question that we might want to ask is, which of these traits evolved first? And so a long time ago, when people were contemplating these questions, there were basically two competing theories. And so the first was that the large brain and skull shape and cognitive function, and then of course with these likely language, probably came before bipedalism. And then the competing theory, of course, was that bipedalism and the other morphological changes came before the increased brain size and complex thinking, basically. So to answer these questions, basically the most useful tools that we have, of course, is the fossil record. So when we look at the fossil record, one of the first major breakthroughs came from this fossil called Lucy. So this was discovered in 1974, and what this was about 40% complete skeleton of an extinct hominin species. So we'll come back to this term hominin. And the fossil name here is AL288-1. And basically why this was such a major breakthrough is not only the very old age of the skeleton, but also how complete it was. So it wasn't uncommon to find skulls or, maybe a femur of one of these basically ancient extinct species. But to have a skeleton this intact and this complete was really, really surprising and really impressive. So Lucy was discovered in East Africa in Ethiopia, and the genus species of Lucy is called Australopithecus afarensis. So this is one of the early species, basically thought to be after the divide of the last common ancestors between humans and great apes. And so Lucy's fossil, it turns out, is about 3.2 million years old. And from other fossils that we've found within this genus species, we have an idea that they probably existed on Earth from around 4 to around 2 million years ago. So Lucy was a female, and she showed clear evidence of upright bipedalism, so walking upright on two legs. And this could be inferred basically from some of her leg bones as well as her spine. And yet, despite walking upright, Lucy still had this really small skull and brain size, which was similar to non-hominin apes. So Lucy's brain was only around, Lucy and other Australopiths' brains are only around 400 cubic centimeters. When we compare that to modern humans, our brain is around 1,300 cubic centimeters, and this size is more similar to basically the great ape species that we see today. So what this provided strong evidence for was the idea that bipedalism evolved before the increase in brain size and, of course, complexity. And then Lucy was around 3.5 feet tall and 65 pounds. So Lucy was kind of this small, upright walking, somewhere between ape and human species. And the way that Lucy got her name actually is after the discovery. I guess the team was just kind of sitting around and celebrating, drinking, and they had Lucy in the Sky. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds came on, and they decided to name her Lucy after that song. Fun fact. Okay, so Lucy provided clear evidence, again, that bipedalism came before increased brain size. So the question is, why did basically this evolutionary trajectory why did we evolve bipedalism? So the great apes that we see today, and probably the last common ancestor that we shared with them, have this form of locomotion called brachiation. And so brachiation is basically the ability to swing between trees and branches with your arms, and that requires a different skeletal structure and different shoulder blades and shoulder composition than we have. So we don't have this brachiation ability. We could do it somewhat, but obviously nowhere near as well as apes. And so brachiation is a form of arboreal locomotion, or moving in the trees. And then apes also have quadrupedalism, or walking on all fours. So chimps and gorillas and such have the ability to walk on two legs, but they don't prefer to do it, and they don't really do it very often. They're much better and more efficient at walking on four legs. So there's this idea that somewhere early in human evolution, our last common ancestor, a population of our last common ancestor, had to come down from the trees for some reason, whether this be an environmental change or maybe a split of the population, some other geographical disturbance. For some reason, it's thought that these basically apes, these ancient apes, had to come down from the trees and start walking. So the question is, what advantages did bipedalism provide for hominins? So there are a bunch of ideas basically, and none of these are totally proven, and probably they're not mutually exclusive either. So probably a lot of these theories could be correct. So one theory is that bipedalism provides increased efficiency for long distance travel. Another is that, of course, bipedalism frees up the hands, which allows easier carrying of things as well as tool design. Bipedalism also gives you taller posture, which would allow better vision for long distance travel, so you can see your surroundings a little better. And basically, these are just some of many theories as to why bipedalism was selected, and some or all of these could be correct. So when we talk about hominins, what are we talking about? So a hominin is basically one of any of the species after the evolutionary split from the last common ancestor with great apes. So that's shown on this timeline here. So back around 8 million years ago is when we shared our last common ancestor between humans and the great apes. And at this point, there was this evolutionary divide in which one lineage basically continued towards the great apes that we have today. And then up here on the top, you can see basically the hominin species along which we arrive at Homo sapiens, or modern humans. So what you can appreciate from this timeline is that there are a lot of different genus species along the way, and these kind of follow this evolutionary timeline. So another thing that I want you to keep in mind about this timeline is that this isn't necessarily linear. So these probably aren't necessarily, some of these are not our common ancestors with great apes. It's unclear the exact basically order of our relatives that led to Homo sapiens. And if we made a phylogenetic tree out of this, it would likely have many branches. And there are also, of course, a lot of fossils probably missing that we just haven't found or weren't preserved along the way. But what we can see within this is this sort of evolution of these species to where the skulls start to look more and more similar over time to modern Homo sapiens. And so some of the genuses within this timeline, we have Australopithecus, which we just talked about, Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, and then we have the Homo genus, of course, which is our relatives like Homo neanderthalensis, which are Neanderthals, and Homo erectus, and etc. So we'll talk about some of these fossils and basically the evidence that they provided of human evolution and sort of this, how these are kind of missing links, quote unquote, along the way from the last common ancestor to modern humans. So fossils within the genus Homo is what we'll talk about next. And so this genus term Homo comes from the Greek word homos, which means same. And so these ancestors basically, of course, are quite similar to us. So first we're going to talk about Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis. Then we'll talk about Homo erectus, then Homo neanderthalensis, and again, you can probably see a familiar word within this, Neanderthal, or better known as Neanderthals. And then we'll talk modern humans, or Homo sapiens. So along this evolutionary lineage, we can actually see, within the fossil record, we can see kind of this process of the evolution of the skulls and basically the brain size. So back here at Australopithecus, which Lucy, of course, is a member of, you can see this, basically this smaller skull cavity in which the brain would sit, and the more ape-like face. And as we get into the genus Homo, you can see kind of this progression to a more human-looking skull. And so within these different species, we start getting the more elongated face, a more pronounced nose, less pronounced eyebrow, crest, and smaller canine teeth. And so these are some of the features that distinguish basically our skulls and our facial morphology from some of our more ancient ancestors. So first, let's talk about Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis. So Homo habilis, a few defining features of this fossil and this species. So Homo habilis had increasing brain size and complexity. So if you remember when we talked about Lucy, she had about 400 cubic centimeter brain. Homo habilis now, we're looking at a brain size of around 700 cubic centimeters and a bit more complexity there too. So the brains are evolving. Homo habilis is now around 4 feet tall, so a little taller than Lucy was. There's evidence of improved bipedalism. So this species was actually better than the Australopiths at walking on 2 legs. They're probably more efficient at it. And here in this species, we start to see evidence of tool manufacturing usage. And so they started making simple tools in order to aid in their scavenging lifestyle, basically. And another difference between the species and some of the older species, or like the Australopiths, for example, are their smaller molars. And this species, Homo habilis, was found mostly in eastern and southern Africa. And they existed, according to the fossil record, around 2.5 to 1 million years ago. Then there's Homo rudolfensis, which is very similar to habilis. And in fact, the first fossil of rudolfensis that was found was actually mistaken for a Homo habilis fossil. Now we distinguish the two into separate species. So Homo rudolfensis, as you can see, the facial structure getting a little closer to humans, and they also had bigger brains than Homo habilis at around 800 cubic centimeters. And again, this longer face, which looks a little more human-like than the more ape-like Homo habilis skull and facial features. And Homo rudolfensis was found in eastern Africa, and we haven't found a whole lot of these fossils, so the only thing we can say for sure is that they existed around 2 million years ago. Okay, next up we have Homo erectus, and so this is a very prominent and important fossil feature within the fossilized record. And so Homo erectus this species exists in both Africa and Asia, and so this is basically the first species that we have evidence of in terms of the human evolution timeline of actually migrating out of Africa. And the African species of Homo erectus is now sometimes classified as Homo ergaster, but this also may be just an earlier relative of Homo erectus. It's not entirely clear what the divide there should be, or whether they should be separate species. There's some debate as to that, but there may be two separate species there. So Homo erectus, again, is starting to get a little bit of a larger brain size, although it's pretty close to habilis and rudolfensis at around 800 cubic centimeters. And one thing that really stands out about Homo erectus is that they started to switch to this hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So if you remember, habilis and rudolfensis had a scavenger lifestyle, but Homo erectus started to adopt this hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And so there's evidence of increased meat consumption in this species, as well as more advanced tool usage. They also started building and intentionally starting fires. And there's evidence that they even wore and could sew clothing. So Homo erectus, there's been fossils found throughout most of Africa and also in East Asia. And we know that the species existed on Earth for a really long time. So they existed from around 2 million to around 110,000 years ago, which is considerably longer if you think about it than Homo sapiens have been on Earth. So pretty successful species. Okay, next up, Homo neanderthalensis, which of course are Neanderthals, or as they're more often called, Neanderthals, which is just kind of, I suppose, an easier way to say it, although Neanderthal is the correct way to say it. And you've probably also heard these referred to as cavemen, which is a bit inaccurate because they didn't actually really spend a whole lot of their lives in caves, but they did bury their dead, and so sometimes we find a lot of their fossils in caves, which is probably how they got the name cavemen, despite the fact that they really weren't necessarily cavemen. So Homo neanderthalensis existed from around 200,000 to around 30,000 years ago. So obviously they had significant overlap with Homo sapiens, and they actually even interbred with Homo sapiens. So there's evidence that some of our genes actually derive directly from Neanderthals, which is really interesting. So Neanderthals also, like us, had a very large skull and brain, and so the average Neanderthal's brain size is around 1,500 cubic centimeters, which of course is significantly bigger than habilis or erectus, etc. And so Neanderthals were probably pretty smart. They existed in Europe, Western Asia, and the Middle East, and they were basically the first hominin that we have evidence of them burying their own dead intentionally. They also used a wide range of tools, so there's evidence of extensive tool usage within this species. They had a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and so these tools aided in that lifestyle. And you can probably see from the picture that there are some skeletal differences between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis. So some of these are that Neanderthals have shorter limbs as well as a more robust and kind of protruding rib cage, and it's likely that these adaptations were better suited to the colder climates that they lived in. And it's possible that Homo neanderthalensis communicated using language similar to modern humans. Okay, so then we arrive at Homo sapiens, of course, modern humans. And so Homo sapiens have been on Earth from around 300,000 years ago to present day, it's thought. We, of course, have a large skull and brain with an average brain size of around 1,300 cubic centimeters. Our brains are very complex compared to other hominin species. And so early Homo sapiens adopted this hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And later on, we started some other basically lifestyles like farming, and then formed more complex societies. One of these distinguishing features, of course, of Homo sapiens from any of the great apes alive today is our complex language that we use to communicate. And so there are, of course, a number of languages that we use today, as well as a number of languages that have basically gone extinct over the years. And again, we form, especially today, we formed very complex societies. So one thing to note, hopefully this gives you, a bit of an idea of kind of this evolutionary timeline from the last common ancestor until modern humans. But an important thing to note is that this fossil timeline that we've showed is not linear, right? So it's likely missing many species along the way that just haven't been preserved or we haven't found them yet. And if we drew out this phylogenetic tree, there'd probably be a lot of different branches to these different species. And so it's not necessarily that Australopithecus evolved into Homo erectus, which evolved into habilis, which evolved into Homo sapiens. These are likely just different branches along this evolutionary tree, which share a last common ancestor with each other along the way. Okay, so that's it for today's lecture. These are the fossils that you should know about for the exam. And for today's lab, we're going to look into this hominin fossil record timeline. So there's a website that has this really cool interactive timeline that not only shows a bunch of these different genus species within the fossil record, but also shows how these might relate to major changes in the climate over the last 8 million years. So your lab will be basically to visit this link. This is also in the Moodle document that has the instructions, and complete the lab report using this interactive timeline. So should be pretty straightforward and also kind of interesting and cool to do. And then the last thing, again, if you've not done so, please download this Respondus software so that you can take the quiz on Thursday. So lab report is due today. And then the key terms list will be due on Wednesday, and the quiz, of course, is Thursday.